Thank you very much, Mudassir, and thank you very much, Kumar, for this very generous and kind introduction. Let me start by greeting everyone who participates in this talk today. Very special greeting to Jennifer, my right-hand person, an assistant from Montreal. Also, I see that a couple of my students, Noah, Elizabeth, former students from Canada, are joining us. And of course, Rohi, a very dear friend and colleague, is also joining us at this very early morning hour from Canada. And also a very special greeting to all my friends and colleagues who are able to join us from Israel. And of course, I'm hoping that the next time we meet, I will be able to greet and address all of you as my newly made and newly acquired friends. Kumar mentioned that we met for the first time a couple of years ago in India when he was launching what was his then recent publication dedicated to Mahatma Gandhi and the creation of the Jewish National Home. Now, during that event, which was a standing room only event, one of Kumar's students came up to me in the hallway and asked, "So, Professor, this was about 2 years ago now. Professor, when is Netanyahu's days are over?" Now, you need to remember that this was the time when the charges, the allegations about some of the corruption cases that eventually landed Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, with the formal indictment were still very fresh. They were far from being a done deal, still relatively early in the discussions that we saw develop and become much more serious later on. My answer to Kumar's student was, "Oh, I don't think that we can talk about the end of Netanyahu's leadership. I certainly think that the question is premature." He was dismayed. Well, maybe dismayed is a harsh word. He was very surprised. And then we had a very nice conversation about why I thought that was the case. Now, in many ways, and this may come as a shock or it may come as a disappointment, but I will try to convince you why I think that in spite of some of the challenges and some of the very concrete problems and issues that Mudassir already highlighted, why I think that there are both long-term structural as well as more short-term proximate reasons why we should still consider the looming or the pending end of the Netanyahu period perhaps premature. Now, let me start by highlighting two important reasons why the question might still appear to be. As Mudassir mentioned, Israel went through 3 general elections within less than a year and within a period of less than a year and a half. Between April 2019, March 2020, there were 3 general elections, each of them having this question as one of the central salient points on which political parties and the different electoral blocks that were formed contested the election about. Yes or no to Netanyahu's continuation in office. And as a matter of fact, the largest challenging force that came together under the name Blue and White is an electoral coalition that brought together 3 different political parties at the time, actually came together in the last minute, just on the eve of the first of these 3 elections, with the issue that brought together these 3 different political parties was to make sure that anybody but Netanyahu, even if it were an alternative politicians from Prime Minister Netanyahu's party Likud, would be an acceptable choice, but there must be now an end to the Netanyahu era. Largely, but not exclusively, this campaign and this argument rested on what became by then a much more concrete and serious charges about corruption. Well, as Mudassir also mentioned, 3 elections later, Prime Minister Netanyahu is still Prime Minister. Yes, under the coalition agreement that paved the way to the formation of the emergency national unity government led by Likud and Blue and White, exactly the principal challenging party that I just mentioned, together with their respective key allies, but not all of them. Even though this coalitional agreement now gave Benny Gantz, the leader of Blue and White, the designation of a prime minister in waiting, or the alternate prime minister who will take over after the expiry of the first 18 months in office, nonetheless, Prime Minister Netanyahu is still reigning supreme. He is still the prime minister of the country. So this is one reason why we should see the end of the Netanyahu era still being a relevant question, but seeing seeds of perhaps suspicion or doubt as to whether this question may not be premature. Two, those of you who have been paying close attention on a daily basis to Israeli politics might have seen that almost on a daily basis, the number of very angry, frustrated Israeli citizens who've been gathering outside the prime minister's residence in Jerusalem, but also in his private residence, Caesarea, is growing. The last count that I saw being reported was about 10,000 people demanding not only an end to what is perceived a very, well, let me just put it this way, problematic management of the coronavirus situation in the country, but also as part of that demand, very clearly and very vocally, the demonstrations are also demanding an end to Prime Minister Netanyahu's term in office. Yeah? The demonstrations have been gaining more and more strength, presence, media coverage, but when you look at Prime Minister Netanyahu managing the faction meetings in the Knesset, when you look at his management of the cabinet, as well as any forum that's under his control, you don't see a prime minister on his way out. So this is the issue on which I would like to pick up and devote the next 20 minutes or so. Kumar asked me to speak for no more than 25, so I will try to be respectful of that timeline. And let me start by, let me start then with an overview of both the deeper structural reasons why I think Netanyahu's days are far from over, and also then look at the more proximate causes. Before we would do either of this, let me start with a very quick overview of Netanyahu's political career. And on the slide that Mudassir just put up, I highlighted the three key markers of the political career of this extremely experienced and distinguished political leader of the country. Yes, he has become by now the longest serving prime minister, who has spent longer in office than now the second longest serving prime minister of the country, former Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. But it's also important to remember that in Netanyahu, we see an extremely experienced and skilled diplomat, legislator, and a former minister and party leader. So this is not someone who owes, this is not a political leader who owes his career to a sudden gain in popularity, which is often the case in political life. Far from it. This is a very well-established, very well socialized, very clearly honed political leader who has gone through the ranks of Israeli politics. Before entering legislative politics, Benjamin Netanyahu served as deputy chief of mission at the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. Thereafter, he served as the country's ambassador to the United Nations, and clearly those were formative years in the mid-late 1980s that allowed him not only to forge very important connections and ties in American political life, but also the American Jewish community, or communities, I should say, but also honed his skill as a diplomat, as a foreign policy guru, as a foreign policy expert, and an extremely skilled orator and communicator. Netanyahu enters legislative political life in 1988. That's the 12th Knesset election, and has been in the Knesset ever since. So that's a legislative career just a little more than 30 years. There was a brief period when, following his loss of the 1999 prime ministerial election, he resigned his seat in the legislature as sign of demonstrating for his electoral defeat. But even after that, he was recruited back in Ariel Sharon's government. So while he was no longer Knesset member in the 15th Knesset, he came back still as and served as a government minister. So this is a prime minister who is one of the longest serving Knesset members, legislators of the country. He has served as minister in the foreign affairs and the finance portfolio, and served 2 separate stints as prime minister. So again, he has been at the very apex, at the very top, if you will, of the political ladder of the country. His first stint as prime minister was in 1996 to 1999. He went on record to be the first Israeli prime minister who won the first direct election to the office of prime minister, beating the much older, much more experienced Shimon Peres, who led the Labour Party at the time. And then, after losing the next election in 1999, Netanyahu leaves as chairman of his party, but comes back in 2005. And that's the third point I want to highlight on this side, that since 2005, he's been, without interruption, the leader, the very strong-willed leader of his political party, Likud, as well. This is important to highlight, because when Netanyahu becomes chairman of Likud, and he already started that in the early 1990s, when still the party is in opposition following the Knesset elections of 1992. But as soon as he assumes the position of chairman of Likud, he starts changing the party. And 2 important points are worth noting in this regard. A, he gradually marginalizes and sidelines the political factions and the very otherwise potentially very powerful alternative leadership contenders, such as David Levy, such as Benny Begin, such as Dan Meridor, and others. Many of them are known as the Likud princes, sort of the second generation, sort of sons or relatives of the first generation of Likud or Herut leaders. He effectively sidelines them politically, by so doing putting an end to what was known as the very otherwise democratic factional politics in the life of the party. So under Netanyahu's chairmanship, Likud's internal factionalism becomes much more centralized. There is really one large faction, which is by definition not a faction anymore, but one political group dominating the internal life of the party, and that is centered around him. And that might come as a surprise if you consider that even late 2019, there was a very important leadership challenge to him, mounted by Gideon Sa'ar, former coalition chairman, former Likud faction chairman, and also Minister Gideon Sa'ar. But again, Gideon Sa'ar is somebody who was recruited to legislative life and Likud politics in significant ways by Netanyahu himself. So it's important to see that even some of the recent challenges to his leadership are coming from his former proteges, so to speak. So Netanyahu changes Likud internally, politically, and organizationally too, by strengthening the office of the Likud chairman and establishing a number of offices that are directly appointed by the chairman, and very importantly, the Likud Elections Committee's chairperson also now falls under the control of the party chairman. So Netanyahu controls Likud, and this is very important. So let me pick up on this point by pushing further and saying why this is so important to consider the future of Prime Minister Netanyahu's leadership in the context of the party itself as well. It's well known that in stark contrast to the former dominant party of the country, Labour, Likud has a very different DNA. Likud doesn't expel, doesn't displace leaders easily or at all. if you look at the number of leaders that Likud has had since the creation of the state, the number is very, very small. You have Menachem Begin, you have Shamir, you have Benjamin Netanyahu, again, 2 stints as chairman and as prime minister, and Ariel Sharon. Now, Menachem Begin leaves office as party chairman because of his choice. He exits under the pressure of the difficult fallout from the First Lebanon War, but also the personal trauma of losing his wife. Yitzhak Shamir, who succeeds Begin, resigns following the 1992 electoral defeat. Netanyahu takes over. When he loses in 1999, he resigns, but comes back. And let me ask Mudassir to turn to the next slide, because the next slide is crucial. When Netanyahu takes over again as party chairman in 2005, look at the graph. The electoral history of Likud is one of sustained, uninterrupted growth. So Netanyahu has been at the helm of a party that historically doesn't expel its leaders, that it really is a party that has built into its genetic code, of course, supplemented by organizational characteristics, a very strong leader and stress on leadership stability and leadership continuity. And Netanyahu adds to this electoral success. Apart from the ad hoc electoral alliance, blue and white, that was able to mount this very potent challenge to Netanyahu in the 2019 and 2020 elections, and that's an electoral alliance of 3 parties. There isn't a single other political party with an organizational infrastructure, with branches all over the country, with a regular routinized process for elite circulation, a mechanism by which people are socialized and brought from the lower to the higher echelons in office, like Likud, with the popularity, with the followers that the party, that Likud has. And if you look at this phenomenal rise in the electoral fortunes in Likud under Netanyahu's leadership, we are talking about just over 250,000 votes in 2006. This is, of course, the election after Likud splits and Kadima is formed under Ariel Sharon. And if you look at the last couple of elections, Likud was picking up just about 1.5 million of the votes. So, and again, in every election, more and more. So the party is in a very healthy electoral shape, and this is important. And this is important because electoral success, of course, gives very reasons. It dampens the possibility and the desire to replace the leader that can keep bringing the party back to electoral prominence and governmental control. Let me ask Mudassir to please turn to the next slide, which highlights another important sort of deeper reason why I think it's very far from talking about the end of the Netanyahu period. And that is the almost unsurpassed ability and skill at building coalitions, keeping Likud in power, whatever coalition composition it takes. Now, this is important to note because the only other prime minister who served nearly this long in power, David Ben-Gurion, was very clear about his coalition strategy. I will never share power with the communists, no to Maki and no to Herut, and no power sharing with Herut, which is the predecessor to Likud, sort of the right wing challenge, the right wing of the Israeli party system. Netanyahu doesn't make, and his approach to coalition formation doesn't rest on such a clear ideological footing. If you just look through the kinds of coalitions that he had and that he headed since 2009 as prime minister, look, between 2009 and 2013, he had a coalition that brought together religious parties, secular right-wing parties, and importantly also labor, the secular left. This was also the time when And this was one of the reasons why the nickname, the magician, Netanyahu earned, and probably accurately so. His government was on the brink of facing the dissolution of the Knesset, when in the last minute he was able to recruit the otherwise largest party in the Knesset at the time, Kadima, to join in what was a national unity government that stayed in office for a little bit longer than 1 month before Kadima would leave, and Netanyahu would finish the rest of that Knesset's term at the head of his right-wing coalition. In the following Knesset, he formed a center-right coalition that included 2 important center parties, Yesh Atid, led by Yair Lapid, one of the principal leaders of Blue and White that challenged Netanyahu in the last election, or Likud in the last election, and Tzipi Levi's Hatnua, again, another centrist formation that we can talk about later in the Q&A if there is any interest. So the only time really that Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, headed a right religious coalition that many would historically identify as the natural ideological coalition for Likud to lead was in the Knesset between 2015 and 2019. Other than that, parties from the left, parties from the center came in and out of Netanyahu's various governments. And today, once again, the magician, so to speak, pulled another trick from the hat. After 3 elections, he was able to convince Benny Gantz to break away from the Blue and White alliance while keeping the name Blue and White, and enter into the emergency national unity government that is, according to the coalition agreement, set to stay in office for at least 36 months. And then, of course, we'll see whether that is going to actually last or not. So these are some of the couple of deeper reasons why I think we need to give, even in the context of the mounting demonstrations, and even in the corruption charges, the beginning of the court proceedings against Prime Minister Netanyahu, and even in the context of his leadership having become the principal electoral theme, we need to remember that we are dealing with a very seasoned politician who has worked with and has the experience of working with very different political parties and movements in the Knesset, and also a politician who very effectively controls his own party, to which he keeps bringing more and more electoral benefit and success. Let me ask Mudassir to please jump the next slide, which is sort of an indication about the economic success of the country during the Netanyahu decade, but I will come to that in the Q&A if there is any interest. But let's skip to the next slide, which is sort of the second last slide that I want to discuss and share with you. So the national unity, the emergency national unity government that is in power today in Israel, is what we call a grand coalition. It includes, and its pivots are the 2 large parties, the 2 largest parties in the Knesset, Likud and Blue and White. And of course, since the Blue and White alliance broke up, the Blue and White, the truncated Blue and White that Benny Gantz brings to the coalition is far smaller, as well as the various allies, principal allies of these 2 political parties. Importantly, one political party that stayed very loyal to Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership throughout the 3 elections in 2009 and 2020. This is a political party alliance, sometimes called Yamina, sometimes called Jewish Home National Union. The different component units of this alliance underwent new and right, different transformations during this brief period of just a year and a bit. Importantly, Yamina, so the new and right, by which it's currently known, has been sidelined by this coalition agreement. So there is a very important right-wing group, small but still important right-wing group in the Knesset that sort of provides support, if necessary, for supporting Netanyahu's and the government's right-wing agenda within an otherwise carefully negotiated and constructed large coalition agreement. Now, very recently, there have been 2 issues that have dominated discussions about the viability of the national unity government. Again, according to the coalition agreement between Blue and White and Likud, and signed by the other partners, and according to this coalition agreement, which was also cemented in an amendment to the basic law on government. So it's very important to note that there is also a law associated with this that cements the desired stability of this government in office. According to these documents, this coalition should last 36 months. If this government were, and this agreement can only be changed or modified or annulled with the agreement of 70 Knesset members. So you really need a large qualified majority to end the life, if you will, of this national unity government. But of course, a majority of Knesset members, 61, can bring a constructive motion of no confidence against the government. If, however, says the agreement and the amendment to the basic law, such a motion of no confidence, a constructive motion of no confidence, were to be brought against the government, neither Benjamin Netanyahu nor the alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz, so neither of the two Prime Ministers and Prime Minister in waiting, can be indicated as the next leader of the government, which the constructive vote of no confidence normally would usher in. That's what a constructive vote of no confidence does. It votes the incumbent government out by bringing in another government. So the law and the agreement says neither Netanyahu nor Gantz can be at the head of such a challenging government. That, of course, doesn't mean that some other politician cannot be nominated as a new prime minister, behind whom, if there is a supporting coalition of 61 Knesset members, cannot bring down the national unity government and then passing the baton or the mantle over to perhaps Prime Minister Netanyahu or whoever the alternative next prime minister might be. So in other words, and the discussions have been really quite frequent in the past few days about this, if there is a path, if Prime Minister Netanyahu is able to bring on board additional Knesset members that would give him that 61 majority, that 61 MK majority, there is actually an institutional solution, a path by which he can undo this current government, and without having to hold new elections, he could actually become prime minister in his full right. Now, whether that's going to happen or not depends on his ability to get those additional Knesset members whose support would be needed to reach the 61. Another important issue that has dominated the discussions as of late is, of course, related to the budget. According to the coalition agreement, there has to be a 2-year budget passed by August 25th. And for the budget to pass, it actually has to be advanced now so that it would make through the legislative processes. If there is no 2-year budget passed, then automatically elections would be advanced. So it is possible that if we don't see a budget agreement, then the new elections will be held as early as November. Blue and White wants to make sure that this agreement to a 2-year budget is respected, while Prime Minister Netanyahu is adamant that the government needs to have flexibility, needs to spend more, because the crisis and the economic pain imposed by Corona on the country demand it. So he wants to deviate from the plan, and he wants a 1-year budget, a more flexible budget, which of course 1 year is pretty much the period while he is still a prime minister in office. This is of course something that's not desired and in the interest of Blue and White, we agree. So we'll have to see. There are two paths, therefore, to seeing an earlier end to this grand coalition government. One, through a no budget, going to new elections, and the other one through institutional machinations, if you will, in the Knesset. Let me ask Mudassir to please turn to the next slide, which is going to show us what were to happen if elections were held tomorrow. This was the question that was used in a poll the day before yesterday by Direct Polls, one of the polling agencies in Israel, and it showed very interestingly that And of course, polls can be read and designed in many different ways. But it's still indicative what people and voters in Israel see and read, and what is being discussed by pundits and political experts. If elections were held tomorrow, this was the result. Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud would still be winning 36 seats. Moreover, if you look at the two numbers in the upper left-hand corner, look at the number in blue, 64. That shows how many seats the right-wing parties together would win if elections were held tomorrow. So if elections were held tomorrow, according to these current polls, not only would Likud still be the largest party, significantly larger than any of the other parties, given that blue and white fell apart, but his right-wing coalition would actually come back with a majority, same majority that it had before the electoral avalanche, if you will, that started in April 2019. Clearly, everybody in Likud and in the right wing is reading this as Netanyahu is still there with enough support to bring Likud or keep Likud in a very lucrative electoral position. Now, and with this, let me ask Mudassir to turn to the very last slide, please. Even with that in mind, even if Netanyahu, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu can win another election for Likud, even if it's premature to talk about the end of his leadership, at some point, succession will have to happen. Whether it's now, or in the medium term, or in the longer term, Prime Minister Netanyahu is not going to be Prime Minister forever. He will be the longest serving Prime Minister, one of the longest serving chairmen of Likud, but there will be a change. So in order to give you a sense of who some of the future leaders might be, it's important to note again that the answer to this question, of course, depends on who will be perceived in Likud as the leader who can galvanize the most electoral support for the party. And for this, the fact that Likud candidates are elected to the party's candidate list in internal primary elections actually gives very good indication, because it shows us how well of a vote getter some of the senior Likud politicians are. So if for a moment, if you just look at the very top row, and that's all I'm asking you to do for now, if you look at the very top row on the image on the right-hand side of this picture, which in Hebrew says Likud, is the National Liberal Political Party. It shows sort of the top ranked candidates that were put forward by the party in the last election. Of course, at the top of the list is Prime Ministerial candidate and now Prime Minister Netanyahu. Next in line is former Knesset Speaker, current Health Minister Yuli Edelstein, who, according to recent polls, is one of the possible and, if so, very viable candidates for the Israeli presidency, an office that will be elected by the Knesset early 2021. Yisrael Katz, the current finance minister, was also, for a short period of time, previous foreign minister. Yisrael Katz is also the head of the Likud organization. So Netanyahu is the chairman, but the party organization is headed by Yisrael Katz, so a very important figure. We have Gideon Adar, who is currently in the United States, serving as ambassador to the United Nations and the United States, and Gideon Sar. Gideon Sar, who is the last challenger to Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership, whom towards the end of 2019, the prime minister soundly defeated in a leadership challenge. So the reason why I wanted to show you this picture is to just paint in broad strokes the fact that there are senior, well-trained, experienced politicians, deeply rooted both in government, strong experience in government, but also in the party, who are there as alternative leaders in the waiting. So I don't see any reason for Netanyahu's leadership to end anytime soon, but when the time comes, any one of these senior leaders would be there in the waiting to take over. Now, the image on the left, I put on this last slide because it shows the two leaders of the smaller right-wing formation, Yamina, the new right, that I mentioned earlier. It's again a right-wing formation that brings together both secular but also religious, moderate right political voices and forces under its label. Yamina is currently not in the government, but its two leaders, Ayelet Shaked, the female politician on the left, and Naftali Bennett, gentleman on the right, served in Netanyahu's last government in the previous Knesset in various roles. Ayelet Shaked was, of course, many of you might remember, former justice minister. So Naftali Bennett has gained tremendous popularity by some, but definitely visibility in terms of the approach and the proposed solutions that he would like the government to take in putting an end to the corona disaster, at least in terms of policy. Because of this visibility, a very interesting poll saw the light of day just a couple of days ago, less than a week ago, according to which 28 of the poll respondents would actually, and this was the largest number for any other politician given, would actually see Naftali Bennett as the next prime minister of the country. So it's important to note that Prime Minister Netanyahu was not one of the alternatives given. But from all the other alternative politicians currently not at the apex of power given, Naftali Bennett was seen as the most charismatic, most visionary alternative leader. I wanted this just to see that even outside the Likud infrastructure, there are politicians in the right who are gaining, even though their party is small, their popularity, their popular reach might become quite a bit broader and wider. So that's another source for an alternative leadership stream to emerge on the day when Prime Minister Netanyahu's leadership days might be over. But as I said, I don't think that is anytime soon. So friends, with that, and with my apologies to Kumar and Mudassir for exceeding the 25-minute agreed upon time limit, let me stop and turn it over to your questions.